Good afternoon, folks. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm just going to give everyone a minute or two as they enter the room to get settled. So feel free to just hang out for a little bit and we will get started in 30 to 45 seconds. Just to quickly introduce myself in the meantime, my name is Krish. I'm the Community Programs Coordinator here at Second Harvest. If you had attended our previous webinar on eating sustainably on a diet, you may recognize me, in which case it is great to see you again. If not, it is my pleasure to welcome you to the next webinar in our virtual speaker series. And we're so excited to bring to you a curated workshop series to build a more robust food recovery network and inspire a stronger commitment from you all and from ourselves as well to food waste reduction practices. So I'll give people a couple more seconds just to enter the webinar here and get themselves settled, and we will get started. In the meantime, feel free to please pop open the chat function there and feel free to introduce yourself. Let me know your name, where you're joining us from in terms of town or city, and if you're part of an organization, let us know which organization you're from as well. And if you're looking for the chat box, you can access that in the toolbar on the bottom. That's just the speech bubble that you see there. Alrighty, so while people are introducing themselves, again, welcome to everyone who is attending. I believe this is the 5th workshop that we're having in our virtual speaker series. Again, my name is Krish. I'm the Community Programs Coordinator here at Second Harvest. I wanted to wish everyone a happy Nutrition Month, and I'm extremely excited to introduce our topic today, which is eating sustainably for the planet. So today we'll be exploring the intersections of healthy eating and environmental sustainability, and what you can do in your household or at your organization to create health and sustainability in your own eating patterns. Before I jump into the content here, I just would love to begin with a quick land acknowledgement. So while we meet today on a virtual platform, we would like to take a moment to acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we're on today. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility in improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. From coast to coast, we acknowledge the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people who call this nation home. Please join me in acknowledging all the harms and mistakes of the past and to consider how we can each in our own way work towards reconciliation and collaboration. Thank you. Now, before we jump into the content here, I just want to go over some quick housekeeping items. So Emily, if you wouldn't mind jumping to the next slide for me. And just to let you know, I am joined by my colleague, Emily, our Community Program Success Coordinator, who will be helping me with some of the tech elements of the webinar today. In terms of those tech elements, one of those are the chat. I think a lot of you are already familiar with that. I'm seeing that people are already introducing themselves. It's great to see that we have tons of people coming in from all over Canada and also the UK. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome. Another feature that I want to highlight is the Q&A section. If you do have any questions that you'd like to have answered, please feel free to pop those into the Q&A, and there will be plenty of time for questions and answers at the end, and I'll be happy to answer any of those for you. You will notice that your audio and video are both turned off. That is just to eliminate any background noise or distractions, and so that you can all focus on my beautiful face. And finally, we also will be running some polls over the course of the workshop as well. So I'll be able to, you'll see those pop up on your screen, and I'll go ahead and test one out right now. So Emily, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide while I pop open that first poll here. All right, so just to get a quick understanding of where everyone's at in terms of your knowledge of eating sustainably for the planet. I would love to get your response to this question, which is how familiar are you with eating sustainably for the planet? All right, and I'm seeing those responses come in very quickly. Thank you, everyone. All right, just 5 more seconds here for those last few folks to get their responses in. Wonderful. Thank you so much for responding to that poll, and we'll go ahead with the presentation here. So Emily, if you don't mind, the next slide. Okay, so just quickly to introduce ourselves and our organization, we are Second Harvest. If you're not familiar with us, we are Canada's largest food rescue organization and experts in perishable food recovery. Our dual mission is no waste, no hunger. It's our commitment to the planet that is both environmental and community focused. And we have an incredible 36-year history of rescuing unsold surplus food from across the supply chain and redirecting that food to charities and nonprofits to serve their in-need communities. Emily, if I could get the next slide, please. Okay, so a brief agenda of what we'll be going over today. I'll quickly go over the food system and how food gets from production all the way to our plates. I'll go over what a healthy, sustainable diet actually means and how that is supported by Canada's Food Guide. And finally, I'll go through some tips in terms of goal setting, whether that be on an individual basis, with your family and friends at home, or on an organizational level. Everyone can benefit from goal setting. So I'll go over what are appropriate techniques in goal setting, how you can set goals that are realistic, and how you can actually go about achieving those goals. Next slide, please. Okay. So what do I mean when I'm talking about a healthy, sustainable diet? So I've taken this definition and I'll quickly read it out to you. A healthy, sustainable diet is a dietary pattern that promotes all dimensions of individuals' health and well-being, has low environmental pressure and impact, is accessible, affordable, safe, and equitable, and are culturally acceptable. On top of that, they support the preservation of biodiversity and planetary health. So we have this definition from the Food and Agricultural Organization of the UN, as well as the World Health Organization, or WHO. So just to summarize that quickly, it's a diet that provides the individual with physical, mental, and social well-being, while also supporting adequate and acceptable food access to future generations. And when we say sustainable in this sense, I don't mean in terms of one you can stick to, but it also means that sustainable here refers specifically to environmentally sustainable. So the next slide, please. Okay, so in order to understand healthy, sustainable diets, it's really important to kind of understand how food gets to us. So the food system entails all the steps it takes to produce food and bring it all the way to the general public. So you may have heard of this in terms of from farm to fork. Throughout this process, a certain percentage of food does not actually make it to our plates and instead ends up in various different places, including the landfill. A large chunk of this is unavoidable or planned food waste, which we refer to as food loss at Second Harvest. But on the other hand, there's avoidable food waste. Now, this is the food that is surplus food. It's perfectly safe to eat, but regardless of that fact, it still ends up in landfill for whatever reason. This category of food waste is still within our control, but regardless, about 1/3 of all the food that's purchased by people like you and me still ends up in the landfill. So this is a significant problem, but why? Emily, if I can get the next slide on, please. And one more. Emily, if you hit forward once, an image should pop up. Wonderful. So when food ends up in the landfill, it really creates the perfect conditions for bacteria to produce things like methane gas. So methane gas, for context, is a very strong greenhouse gas, which contributes to global warming, habitat destruction, and of course, climate change. I think we've all heard about greenhouse gases and the worsening effects of climate change and how this can affect future generations. So we want to avoid food waste becoming that large of a problem. Right now, when you're thinking about food waste in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, if food waste was a country, it would be ranked third after both the United States and China. So it's a significant problem that we have the ability to control. In addition, it's also the runoff that we get from landfills, right? It can contaminate groundwater sources, and all of those kind of nasty, acidic chemicals that are being produced by those bacteria are contaminating what little freshwater ground sources we have left. Next image. So in addition, when we waste food, we're not only throwing away the food, right? It's not just the nutrient value or the monetary costs of the food that we have purchased and are preparing at home. It's also every single last resource that's been used in producing that food, processing that food, transporting that food, and that we often think of in terms of the energy, the land, and the water that goes into every step of that food system. Next slide, please. So I'd love to know, before I do go into this myself, how would you define a healthy diet? And maybe if you can tell me this in the chat, what is your definition of a healthy diet? Great, so I'm seeing eating a variety of foods. That's a great one. Thinking about portions, locally sourced foods is a really good one as well. Eating local again. Balance is a really good component, yeah. Fruits and vegetables. Proteins, wonderful. So I'm seeing some really great things in here. And Emily, if you wouldn't mind pulling up the image on the slide. All right, so who here is familiar with Canada's Food Guide and using this particular resource? The one that you see up on the screen there. Wonderful, so I'm seeing a few yeses. I'm seeing familiar, but not quite using it. Wonderful, I'm glad someone pointed out that that's not the current food guide. Emily, if you wouldn't mind hitting forward one more time. And once more, there we go. So this is the more recent Canada's Food Guide. It was updated at the beginning of 2019 and released publicly for the general public to use. I really like it because it talks about food at a higher level. And what I mean by that is when we're thinking about food, we're not necessarily thinking about, food groups and portion sizes. We eat in terms of what we see on our plate. We're a visual species, so we think about things a little bit less mechanically, right? You don't necessarily go into the kitchen and say, oh, I'm gonna eat a cup of vegetables. It's more along the lines of how much room does the vegetables take on your plate? So great, we have Canada's Food Guide as a really good resource in terms of a healthy diet, but what might we use in terms of a sustainable diet? And Emily, if you wouldn't mind going forward a slide. Perfect. Has anyone seen this before? This particular image or graphic. It's a really nifty graphic. It kind of tells us a little bit more about the different types of foods and their impact on the environment. So as I'd mentioned, in the food system, we often talk about production, processing, transportation, storage, disposal. And this is a really good graphic in terms of each food group and where it really falls in terms of the impact that it has on the environment. That can be in terms of the resources that it uses, in terms of the greenhouse gases, and the amount of waste that each food group presents. Now, this is a little bit difficult to conceptualize in terms of the way that we eat. So Emily, if you wouldn't mind going forward one more slide. Okay, so this is the Planetary Health Plate that was released by the Harvard School of Public Health. It breaks down what an ideal diet would look like to achieve optimal health outcomes while also minimizing environmental impact. Does this particular plate remind you of anything? Does it look familiar at all in terms of the proportions or in terms of the contents on that plate? It's a lot of greens there I'm seeing. Emily, if you wouldn't mind popping up the next image. Rhonda, that's perfect. The new Canada's food guide. So you'll see that the proportions are really, really similar, right? You have that half plate of vegetables and fruit. You're seeing a good amount of grains on there. Does anyone see any differences between these two? And feel free to just pop those in the chat. Are there specific differences that you're seeing between the Canada's Food Guide and the Planetary Health Plate? Great, I'm seeing some great responses there in terms of meats and dairy, plant-sourced proteins. Yeah, it looks like animal-based proteins are pretty small. The oils are marked unsaturated. That's a really good point. We often talk about unsaturated and saturated fats, and unsaturated fats are the ones that are healthy for you versus saturated fats that you generally want to avoid. So yeah, in terms of the differences there, one thing that you'll notice is it differentiates between starchy vegetables and non-starchy vegetables. So you'll see that really thin brown sliver there that refers to starchy vegetables, things like potatoes and such, which are healthy parts of your diet, but maybe not in the same proportions as, nice leafy vegetables and things like that. The other thing that is different that a lot of people had mentioned there is the differences between proteins, right? You're still seeing that whole protein section take about a quarter of the plate, but it is differentiated between dairy foods, animal-sourced proteins, as well as plant-sourced proteins. And I'll go into that a little bit more as well, because they do have different impacts on the environment if you think about that pyramid that I showed you before. And finally, they do refer as well to sugars and unsaturated oils. The Canada's Food Guide does talk about added sugars and unsaturated oils. It just does not make an appearance on the plate itself, but it is within the best practices in terms of healthy eating if you want to read further into that. So Emily, if you wouldn't mind heading to the next slide, please. So now that we have a great idea in terms of what a healthy diet looks like and what a sustainable diet looks like, how do we really put those together? One is choosing nutritionally dense foods and in healthy proportions. Two is choosing foods that require fewer resources to produce. And three is reducing the amount of food that actually goes to landfill. Now, number two is a little bit trickier on a consumer level because it does require you to do a lot of your own research and think about each food in terms of its environmental impact. So you can always refer to that pyramid that I showed you earlier in terms of which foods are higher in environmental impact and which foods are lower in environmental impact. But we will focus a little bit more on number three, which is reducing the amount of food that goes to landfill. If anyone had attended our previous workshop on eating well on a budget, we definitely dove into choosing nutritionally dense foods in healthy proportions, but I'll try and marry those two things together. So to investigate this further, let's talk a little bit more about how sustainability is supported by the Canada's Food Guide. So Emily, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide here. Okay, so the Canada's Food Guide is not just the healthy plate model, but they do refer as well to a lot of behaviors around foods. So I've pulled out these 3 specific points about the Canada's Food Guide, and I would love to explore them a little bit farther with you all, just to go over some of the details there. So number 1 is processed foods. So Emily, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide there. All right, so number 1 is some processed foods can be part of a healthy eating pattern. I did go over this in our last workshop, but just in case there's anyone that did not attend the last workshop, I just wanted to briefly highlight this as well. So Emily, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. And I'm going to launch a quick poll here, if everyone wouldn't mind answering this question, is which of these peas has the highest nutrient value? Would it be fresh? Would it be canned with no salt added? Or would it be frozen? And I'm hoping any of you that attended my last workshop will get this correct, because I did stress this point. Okay, I'm seeing about 3/4 of the room has answered the question so far. And I'll leave about 10 seconds for everyone to get in their last responses there. So would it be fresh peas that has the highest nutrient value, canned peas, frozen peas, or none or all of the above? All right, so I'll actually go ahead and share the results here so we can see what everyone answered. So a couple of responses there in terms of canned, and it's pretty evenly split on the other 3. Now, the correct answer, Emily, if you wouldn't mind hitting forward one time, is all of them. So there's all preserved peas, or all preserved fruits or vegetables are preserved at peak ripeness and are able to hold on to their nutrient value. So you don't really need to worry too much about whether you're getting something fresh, frozen, or canned. What you do need to worry about is the amount of overall processing that goes into each of these products. So for example, when you're talking about canned peas, I did mention for a reason that they're no salt added. If you were to add salt to those canned peas, it would require further processing and it would eliminate some of the nutritional value of the peas. So if we can go to the next slide here. I have another poll that I'd like to administer. So I'm going to pull up a series of different food items here. And I'd like you to classify each of these as one of the 3 following categories. The first category is minimally processed or unprocessed. The second category is processed. And the third category is ultra processed. So Emily, if you wouldn't mind pulling up all 4 of those actually, because all of these are going to come up at once. We've got steak, we've got celery sticks, we've got chips, and we've got canned beans. So please go ahead and let me know what you think of the level of processing in each of these items. All right, I'm seeing some interesting responses come in here. So about half the room has finished. And while I'm waiting for the room to do that, Susie had asked a great question about fruits and vegetables being shipped from a long distance, having high impact. And that is absolutely correct. If a fruit or vegetable is being transported over a long distance, it obviously is going to have more impact in terms of fuel costs and things along those lines. So I think a lot of people at the beginning of the presentation had mentioned buying locally. Another thing that I'd add to that recommendation is buying in season. Those are 2 good strategies to still buy fruits and vegetables that are of a lower environmental impact. So I'm going to go ahead and end this poll here, and I'll quickly share the results here. All right, so the first one is steak. So is steak minimally processed or ultra processed? So about half the room said minimally or unprocessed, and about half the room said processed. The correct answer is actually minimally processed or unprocessed. So I'm not talking about here in terms of the environmental impact. Yes, in the previous slides, we saw that steak is one of those items that are that have more of a negative impact on the environment. That being said, it is a minimally processed or unprocessed food because it's still very much in its natural state. And there is some minimal processing that happens in terms of removing the inedible parts, which is in line with that minimal condition. So the next one is celery sticks. Are these minimally processed or processed or ultra processed? I think most of the room got this correct in that it is minimally processed or unprocessed. Yes, they are, the ends of them have been chopped off and they have been put into these plastic bags that you see there. But both of those conditions are still under the umbrella of minimally processed or unprocessed. One thing that you may want to consider is when you're buying celery sticks with this, you don't necessarily know what happened to that inedible piece, that quote unquote inedible piece. The ends of the stalks are perfectly usable for things like broth and stalks and things like that. So if you are going to buy celery, I'd highly recommend that you buy celery in its natural state with all of those lovely leaves and the ends there. So you can, stick them in your Caesar or use them for your stalk or your mirepoix. Chips, I think most people got this. Yes, it's an ultra processed food, and I'll go over exactly what that means. And I'm glad that most of the room got canned beans correct as well. It is processed because they're not in their natural state. And if you go to the next slide there, I'll quickly go over what the difference is between all of these. Okay, so those three definitions that we looked at was minimally processed or unprocessed, processed or ultra processed. I think a really good example of this might be thinking about flour, right? In terms of the minimally processed version of that food, it would be wheat or whatever other grain that you might be referring to. But how likely is it that you would go and pick up a bushel of wheat from the grocery store, take it home, mill it, turn it into flour, and then use that flour for whatever you decide to use it for? Not very likely. It's very labor intensive and may not be something that everyone wants to go through the whole process of doing it in. So in terms of something like flour or wheat, we often will buy it in a processed format just for the convenience sake. The same thing goes for the canned beans that we saw, right? Some of us have the time to be able to buy dried beans, soak them overnight, and then boil them until they are ready to eat. Whereas some of us may not have as much time or effort on our hands. So we buy the canned variety so that we're able to, quickly throw them into a stew and they are ready to be eaten or ready to be cooked. The ultra processed version of wheat or flour would be something like cookies, right? And what ultra processed means is that they have additives that are not necessarily the natural state of foods. They often are substances that are extracted from other foods. So things like fats, starches, added sugars. It can be things like artificial flavors, stabilizers. And these are mainly added for the purposes of making the texture or the flavor of a food more appealing to the individual. So thinking back to that example of chips, we often will add a lot of hydrogenated oils or salts and you name it to the packet of chips. So if we can go to the next slide here. All right, so some quick reasons why you might want to choose frozen or canned varieties over the other varieties. We do throw a lot of food away because it reaches the end of life before we have the time to consume it. Things like spinach, I can be guilty of sometimes. I buy those big bags of spinach because there's not really a smaller option available. And then by the time I can get to the end of it, sometimes it starts to wilt. So what I try to do when I know that something is about to go bad is I throw it in the freezer myself, and then I can throw that in a smoothie or something like that. So frozen or canned vegetables will often be at peak ripeness or peak nutrition. They have a longer shelf life. You're automatically taking a lot of the prep work out for things like beans, etc. And my recommendation is always to look for something that is no salt added or might have different varieties that might not have a seasoning added to it already. You can do that at home. My justification is, why let a food company ruin your health through sodium when you can do that yourself, right? No, I'm just kidding. Try to reduce the amount of sodium that you are consuming in your diet. If we can go to the next slide there. And one more. Okay, so the next step in Canada's food guide is to be aware of food marketing. So I just want to do a really quick activity here. Emily, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. Okay, so I want everyone to close your eyes and imagine you just walked into a grocery store. I know it's kind of weird to do this over a virtual platform. You're sitting in front of a computer and you have your eyes closed. But trust me on this, just close your eyes, imagine you just walked into a grocery store, and I'll lead you through a bit of a role play or a mindfulness exercise. So you've just walked into a grocery store, and let's say that you're walking into the produce aisle. Think about, the sights that you see, the sounds that you hear, the smells that you're smelling. Maybe you're hearing, someone speaking over the public announcement system. Maybe you're smelling the fresh scents of different fruits and vegetables. Maybe you're feeling a little bit of mist from the grocery aisles that have the leafy vegetables being misted every 10 to 15 minutes. And let's say you take a look at your grocery list. The first thing that you see on that list is apples. It can be whatever variety of apple that you like to eat. Macintosh, Granny Smith, Golden, Fuji, and I could go on with different species of apples. But let's say it's your favorite type of apple and you head over to the apple aisle there. Think about what you see when you take a look at those apples. How are they arranged? What color are they? What size are they? Are they shiny or dull? Do they have any markings on them? And you go to reach for an apple. Now, what are you considering when you go to reach for that apple? Are there specific qualities that you're looking for in that apple that you think is right for you or your family to be eating? Are there certain apples that you might put back on the shelf because they don't meet what you determine to be, appropriate to eat? And Emily, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. And if everyone could open their eyes. Now, did most people picture something that looks like this? Something that is, all one color, whether that was red or yellow or green. You won't always see a leaf on it, but that's always kind of a nice way to think about apples when you are picturing one. You'll notice that there's no kind of variation in the color. It's one color all around. Super shiny. It looks, juicy and ready to eat. And if we can go to the next slide. Is this something what you pictured when you were approaching the apple aisle? They're all perfectly laid out, and the light is hitting them just right so that they look super, super attractive. They're laid out in a nice uniform way. They're all sorted by color. Did anyone picture something along those lines when they were thinking about the aisles? And Emily, if we can go to the next slide. Did anyone picture something like this? You know, a bucket full of apples that are all different shapes and sizes and colors. Some of them might be shiny, some of them might not be. Yeah, Rhonda has a really good point. At the Superstar, they have a naturally imperfect bag of apples. They often are at a cheaper variety, which is great. Susie and Darlene both mentioned the farmer's market. Yes, oftentimes you'll see you know, more imperfect foods at the farmer's market. Perfect. And if we can just go to the next slide here. I just wanted to bring this up because I wanted to go over imperfect food. So how blemishes and things are not always an indication of food safety or quality. And just to highlight that we've been trained to think about food in a very certain way in terms of what is safe or appropriate for us to eat. So I just wanted to highlight that with you in terms of the role that food marketing plays in terms of food waste. Now, Emily, if you wouldn't mind going 2 slides forward, I just want to be mindful of the time here, and I want to make sure that we're able to go into the meat of the presentation here, which is planning what you eat. And if you can go 1 slide more. Perfect. So I wanted to quickly go over what meal planning might look like in terms of thinking about both health and sustainability. Before I do that, I will mention, Susie had mentioned always thinking that imperfect food will go bad quicker, which is not always necessarily true. Imperfect foods can hold their own per se, but I think an important thing to keep in, to factor in is being able to do different things with food. I think someone had mentioned above different ways of preparing apples, right? You might consider doing applesauce, apple chips, incorporating apples into baking is something that I love to do as well. I'm an avid baker. So always think about different ways that you can use foods before they go bad. Apples on salads is a really great one as well. So let's go into the next slide there. Okay, so why should you plan what you eat? I don't think I need to explain to you that you can make healthier choices. You won't be stuck in a situation where you need to make a quick decision, and you can be more intentional about the way that you eat. You can obviously save time on grocery shopping if you have a list instead of scrambling to think of things on the spot. Of course, you can meal prep a little bit faster because you can delegate tasks to people in your household. And hopefully you're able to get your whole family or roommates on board with cooking together. You can also prepare ingredients in advance. And of course, it reduces stress. You can think now so that you can act later. And when you're a little bit more stressed out, you don't have to think about what you're going to eat because you've already decided. So let's go to the first tip in terms of planning what you eat, or the first step. So number 1 is taking inventory. I think it's always important before you plan your meals to think about what's already in your fridge or your freezer, what's already in your pantry. A really good idea is to consider sorting these items by category according to Canada's Food Guide or the Planetary Health Plate that I mentioned. And this will help you build meals that are well balanced. If you have any non-perishable or frozen items, it's always good to have a running list just to know what's available within your kitchen. What I do is I have a whiteboard up on my fridge, and that has my meal plan as well as what non-perishable or frozen items I have available. So I know in terms of how I can use those items rather than having to look at what's in my fridge or my freezer. I will say this is not a picture of my actual fridge. My fridge is not nearly this well organized or anything like that. I'm sure mine is probably messier than most of yours. But I think by having a running inventory of what's in my fridge, it makes things easier in terms of knowing what's there and crossing things off. So if you can go to the next slide here. Number 2 is estimating the shelf life of all of these items. we have a really good resource at Second Harvest. It's called our Food Consumption Timetable, and it goes over different food categories and how long they can realistically last past the best before date. And it encourages you to use your 5 senses in determining whether or not food is actually gone bad. If you are looking for more information on that, I highly recommend you go to our training and education portal, training.secondharvest.ca. Emily has kindly linked you to the food consumption timetable there, which is a great resource. You can also go over our e-module on a guide to food date labels. And Susie has a great quote in there, best before date, best before does not mean worse after. Next slide, please. This is just a quick example of what your food inventory list might look like. So I've written there a food item, when to use it by, a little checklist just to make sure that you've used all of that food at the end of the week. One thing that you might want to take into account as well is food category. All right, next slide, please. So how can you go about planning recipes in a way that is both healthy and sustainable? So by planning to use ingredients across recipes, you can really cut down on your food waste. You can also try to think about introducing leftover ingredients in unconventional ways or ways you did not originally plan. So an example of that might be at some point this week or this weekend, I have lit up the barbecue and I thought I would grill some asparagus. Based on the amount of people that we had, I didn't actually need to grill all the asparagus that we bought. So I had to think about different ways that I can use that asparagus so it doesn't go to waste. Now, one thing that I don't usually do is add asparagus to my eggs. But this time around, I was like, you know what? I have this leftover asparagus from the weekend. Let me instead chop it up and add it to an omelet with some feta. And it was fantastic. It's not something that I usually do. I decided to be a little bit adventurous. It doesn't have to be anything fancy or complicated, but trust your gut in terms of your ability to use food in different ways. And that's a really good way to go into planning meals that are healthy and sustainable without producing any food waste. I think I'd mentioned a few of these other tips in our Eating Well on a Budget workshop in terms of, always sticking to your list when you go to the grocery store. When you're thinking about meal planning, thinking about how the proportions match. An easy way to do this is by incorporating 2 different vegetables or fruit with each meal, 1 type of grain and 1 protein. Remember that it doesn't always have to look like the healthy plate model, but what you want to take into account are proportions. If I can get the next slide, please. So this is similar to what I use in terms of meal planning. So you'll see that there's breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Some people may want to add a snack in there. And what makes it easy for me to do healthy, balanced meals is you'll see that there's a green strip, a yellow strip, and a brownish strip there. Because of the ratio of those different food categories, it helps me with planning because it reminds me that I need to have double the amount of fruits or vegetables versus the other things that you see in there, like whole grains or protein. And of course, I leave a space in there for other in case there is, in case I want to leave room for dessert or, one of those sometimes foods. Next slide, please. And now I'll go into some really quick tips in terms of tracking your diet and setting goals. So if I can go to the next slide, Emily. Okay. So how do you go about actually tracking your diet and making sure that you are making a difference in terms of adopting a diet that's more healthy or sustainable? The key to all of this is collecting data. I know that sounds like a scary word. Often when we think about data, we're thinking about these huge spreadsheets in Microsoft Excel, but data comes in so many different forms. One of those can be a picture journal. One of those can be what I just showed you, which is meal planning. And I'll quickly mention one as well, which is a food waste audit, which is a little bit more involved of a process, but especially if you're at a large organization, it can be a very simple and effective tool for measuring food waste and sustainability at your organization. So Emily, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. Okay, so the first tip is keeping a picture journal. The difficult part here is actually remembering to take a photo of your food each time you eat, but some of us already do this, right? I think especially for people who are around my age, millennials, or even Gen Z, we're often being told you're always on that darn phone. But we're often taking photos of our food, posting it to Instagram and so on. So as I mentioned, one really hard thing is remembering to take a photo of your food, right? But it's important to remember that thoughts yield words, words yield actions, and actions yield habits. The nice thing about a picture journal is that it actually helps you with a recall, right? By seeing it in a visual format, you're able to recall things like contextual factors, how you were feeling that day, and if that played a role in whether or not there was food waste, and thinking about what proportion of that meal you may have actually consumed or not. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is just a quick example of a weekly meal plan. And an advantage here is that you're just tracking meal plans that you've already created, right? The disadvantage here is that you're capturing what you intended to eat versus what you actually ate. And you may have poorer recall just by seeing words on a page versus a photo journal, which might be able to elicit more memory based on what you see there. But if you are diligent about taking notes, it could be really advantageous in collecting more quality data. And you can capture more details in this format than just a photo. So it requires a little bit more input, but it's certainly easier to analyze. And Emily, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, I'll quickly introduce our third tool, which is a food waste audit. Now, because we have an e-module on how to do this, I won't go into too much of it, but you can check out our e-module at training.secondharvest.ca. Next slide, please. All right, so once you've collected that data, what do you do with it? I've posted a couple sample questions there that you can kind of ask yourself to reflect. One is how much of the food that I bought was actually consumed. So you're just informally doing a food waste audit just by kind of getting an idea of going through your grocery list and making sure that you used all of those things, or going through your food photo journal or your meal plan to ensure that all of the food that you intended to eat was actually consumed. Another thing that you might want to consider is whether or not the meals that you planned and ate are in accordance with what you consider to be healthy or nutritious. Again, thinking about the Canada's Food Guide is a really good tool to be able to evaluate this on your own. And of course, you can also talk about things in terms of which ingredients you used, which meals you enjoyed, how many of your grocery items you used, and so on. And finally, we will go over setting goals for sustainable diets. So Emily, if you wouldn't mind going 2 slides forward. Rochelle, I do see your question, your comment there, and I just want to clarify, we do have all of our in-person trainings on hold, but you can definitely still access any of our e-modules. So if you go to training.secondharvest.ca and you log in, you will see, I think there's 4 e-modules there that you'll be able to access. So hopefully you're able to access those. Otherwise, shoot us an email and we can help you with accessing those. So in terms of goal setting, I'll quickly go over this to leave time for questions. In terms of goals, you want to make sure they are SMART goals. I think many of us have heard of SMART goals before, but just to recap what that means, you want to make sure that they are specific, so you are achieving what you're actually hoping to achieve. They're measurable, so you have some way of knowing once you've actually achieved them. Actionable, you can actually assign objectives to make sure that you're laddering up to those goals. reasonable, making sure that you're not setting yourself up to fail, and time-based. So you are setting a time limit or a schedule in terms of those goals. So I'll go over a couple of examples. Emily, if you wouldn't mind pulling up the first slide there. Let's say your first goal is to reduce your food waste, right? It's a good goal and an honorable goal, but it's not necessarily specific enough in terms of what you're setting out to achieve. Emily, if you wouldn't mind hitting the next note there. So what might be better is setting your goal to decrease the pounds or the number of food items of perishable food that you throw away each week from 30% to 20% over the next weeks. So is that specific? Yes, you're talking about either the pounds or number of items of perishable food that you're throwing away. Is it measurable? Yes, because you're talking about the pounds of food or you're talking about the number of items. Is it actionable? Yes, I've included a couple of steps there that you might want to do in order to make that goal happen. Is it realistic? I think a 10% decrease is perfectly reasonable or realistic. And of course, you're thinking about this in terms of the next 4 weeks, so it's certainly timely. Just in the interest of time here, I will skip the next example and couple of slides, but I will go over to the summary slide. Emily. Wonderful. So just to recap what we learned today, one is that processed foods can be part of a healthy and low waste diet. Number two is that healthy foods do not always have to look perfect. So thinking about that example of the apples. Three is by planning what you eat, you can reduce food waste and also increase healthy choices. And four is by tracking your eating patterns, you can create change at home by doing things like keeping a photo journal or keeping track of your meal plans and setting SMART goals to be able to measure change. So I will quickly go to the next slide and pull up a quick poll here once again, if you wouldn't mind letting me know what you think. So what have you learned about sustainable diets today? How familiar would you say you are with eating sustainably for the planet after having attended this workshop? And in the meantime, I will start answering some questions here. All right, one is, do you have a slide of the criteria between minimally processed, etc.? I do not, but if you want to follow up with me via email, I would be happy to send over some more information on that. Or you can check out the Harvard School of Public Health. They do have some information on the difference between minimally processed, processed, and unprocessed food. Rhonda had asked a question about the sustainable food graphics. Again, Rhonda, feel free to follow up with me by email, and I'd be happy to send those over to you. I think you're referring to the Planetary Health Plate, which you can find at Harvard School of Public Health's website, and the other one would probably be the pyramid, I think, that you're referring to. Sarah had mentioned it depends on the food items. There are certain foods which are shipped rather than flown and have a lower impact than producing in a greenhouse somewhere else. A great example are bananas. Of course, yeah, I think there are several different factors that need to be taken into account in terms of how many resources are taken up in terms of even producing that food, let alone transporting it, storing it, and selling that food in a local context. So that's why I didn't lean too much into number 2 in terms of those 3 tips for a healthy, sustainable diet, because it does require a lot of research on your own end. All right, thank you everyone for submitting that poll there. And before we launch into Q&A, Emily, if you wouldn't mind pulling up the next slide there. All right, I just wanted to highlight one of our upcoming really exciting virtual speakers series. It is the Food Defender series. It'll be taking place over 2 days on April 28th and 29th at the end of next month. It'll be a 2-day virtual speaker series featuring special guests. So we've actually recruited Bob Bloomer from TV, who you might be familiar with, who will be talking about using food to its greatest potential. And we've also brought on a couple of BIPOC folks from within the community who will be sharing with us their lived-in experiences about food waste prevention and using food to its full potential. In terms of, let's go ahead into questions and answers here. I'm seeing that Rochelle had asked a question about getting an email copy of the PowerPoint. We will not be emailing out the PowerPoint, but what we will be doing is hosting our PowerPoint on our online resource library. So that will be coming out probably in the next couple of months, and it'll host all of the recordings and PowerPoints and print resources that will be available to anyone who has attended Second Harvest trainings, and you'll be able to access them that way. So we do have about 5 minutes for questions. I apologize that I couldn't leave any more time there. There was a lot of content to go through, but feel free to pop your questions either into the Q&A or into the chat box there. Susie had asked a question about, does a long shipping and storage period impact nutrition? No, depending on how they are stored, right? So when you're thinking about canned and frozen items, they are preserved at peak nutrition, so you don't need to worry about them diminishing in terms of nutrient quality. With something that is fresh, of course, when they're being shipped, they're usually being shipped before they're even ripe. So they're shipped in a way that by the time you actually receive them, they're usually at peak ripeness or nutrient value. And you'll see that a lot with bananas as an example, right? You'll see them green a lot of the time when they're sitting on the shelf, and you usually have to wait a couple of days before they are at peak nutrient and value and ripeness. Any other questions here? I probably have time for 3 or 4. So I'm seeing a question about where we can find more data on various meat and dairy versus plant-based proteins when it comes specifically to Sustainably for the planet. I would highly recommend consulting the Harvard School of Public Health. They've done a lot of research and a lot of reports about healthy planets and healthy plates. So if you look up healthy planets and healthy plates, they have lots of different resources. They have print resources, they have articles and so on that really does a deep dive into this topic. So Harvard School of Public Health, look up healthy planets and healthy plates, and you'll be able to find most of the answers that you're looking for. So Janine had asked a question about the processing of dried beans versus canned beans. In terms of nutrition, it really doesn't have too much of a difference, of course, assuming that you're using the no salt added variety. It really just comes down to your own personal preference. With dried foods, they often will come cheaper than canned, right? So if you are more concerned about budget and are willing to spend more time, I think a dried bean would be a better variety for you. Whereas if you are less focused on cost and you are more concerned about your time and efficiency, then canned beans might be a better variety for you. I'm getting a question about avocados and whether or not they are fine to eat once they've gone black on the inside. If they have not been cut and they're black on the inside, I would not recommend eating them. If you have cut them and they're starting to go brown, that's completely normal. That's just oxidization. It doesn't mean that it's bad to eat in any way. It just, I mean, obviously doesn't look as pretty, but it's perfectly fine to eat. And finally, I'm seeing a question about BPA in canned foods. I believe canned foods are, I think BPA has more to do with plastic, but I can't confidently answer that question. I apologize, but that's not within my wheelhouse. So I'm going to answer one more question that I'm seeing here about the place of affordability, availability, and accessibility in eating sustainably. I think that's a really good point, and there are three really important elements in terms of food security. And I think in terms of eating sustainably, there is an element of privilege there, right? In terms of what foods we can afford and what foods we are able to access. I think the important thing is eating in a way that is right for you, but just being mindful of the practices that you're using around food waste. I think when you are someone that doesn't have quite as much leeway in terms of affordability, availability, and accessibility, the important part that you can focus on is food waste prevention. Using every last bit of the fruit or vegetable or the meat or the grain that you are purchasing, and just making sure that you are using every food to its full potential. If you're interested in learning more about that, I would highly recommend attending that Food Defender series that I mentioned. You can register for that on Eventbrite. So unfortunately, that's all the time that we have left for questions. I just want to thank everyone so much once again for attending. If you want to register for our upcoming workshop or Food Defender series, again, that's on Eventbrite. And you can also look out for any future education and training opportunities that we will be posting there. Again, my name is Krish. I'm the Community Programs Coordinator here at Second Harvest. It was such a pleasure to have all of you here, and I hope all of you have a great rest of your week. Thank you so much. Take care.